In a remote town in Alaska, a chilling case unfolds that would haunt both the police department and the community for years to come. The brutal murder of 19-year-old Sonya Ivanoff sends shockwaves through the small population, igniting fear and suspicion among the residents. As investigators delve into the circumstances surrounding her death, they are confronted with a scene so horrifying that it leaves a lasting impression on everyone involved. The atmosphere of fear is palpable. Police officers who once patrolled the quiet streets now find themselves feeling threatened, as if the very shadows could harbor the murderer among them. Rumors swirl and whispers fill the air, with the entire town on edge, grappling with the terrifying realization that a predator walks free among them. In a place where everyone knows each other, the sense of safety has been shattered, and the quest for justice becomes a race against time to restore peace to a community gripped by fear. Nestled along Alaska's isolated western coast, Nome is a remote settlement where life is shaped by the vast wilderness and extreme conditions of the Arctic. Its roughly 3,500 residents form a close-knit community where everyone knows each other by name. This town, once a bustling hub during the gold rush era, now stands as a quiet reminder of Alaska's rugged past. Nome's remoteness has created a culture of self-reliance and unity among its residents, who share both the challenges and joys of life in one of America's most isolated regions. Here, people depend on one another in ways unique to small, isolated communities, forming bonds that go back generations. Nome is characterized by low crime rates, with little more than the occasional dispute or petty theft disrupting the town's peace. For most, life in Nome is simple and predictable, and safety is almost taken for granted. The police force is small, familiar with residents and their daily routines, and the most serious issues are typically handled with a handshake and a conversation. Rarely does an event occur that makes the community feel anything less than safe. But in the summer of 2003, that changed. The brutal murder of 19-year-old Sonya Ivanoff marked a defining, dark moment for the town. Her tragic death sent shockwaves through the community, introducing a level of fear and suspicion that Nome had never experienced. Residents who once left doors unlocked began taking precautions, their sense of security shattered. Rumors and unease spread quickly, and the familiar faces around town suddenly seemed less trustworthy. The incident forced Nome's residents to confront a chilling reality. Even in the most remote and seemingly secure places, danger could find its way in. Sonya's death would forever alter the community's sense of safety, leaving a lasting scar on the heart of Nome. On August 12, 2003, the tight-knit community of Nome felt the first unsettling stirrings of fear when Sonya Ivanoff, a lively and beloved 19-year-old, was reported missing by her roommate, Tim. The two shared a small apartment in town, and for Tim, Sonya was more than just a friend. She was like family. Sonya was known for her dependable nature and habit of checking in with her loved ones. When she failed to return home after a night out with friends, Tim initially assumed she might have stayed over at someone else's place, as young people in Nome often did. But as dawn broke and there was still no sign of Sonya, Tim began to worry. Throughout the morning, Tim tried calling Sonya, only to be met with silence. With each unanswered call, her concern deepened, and she began reaching out to mutual friends, asking if anyone had seen Sonya or heard from her since the previous evening. Unfortunately, no one had any information. Sonya's phone appeared to be off, and no one could confirm her whereabouts after the night out. Hours stretched on with no sign of Sonya, and Tim's worry turned into a gnawing fear that something terrible had happened. When she reported Sonya missing to the police later that day, Tim was already dreading the worst. Sonya wasn't the type to disappear without a word. She was responsible, and even after nights out, she always made her way home. The police, recognizing the seriousness of her sudden disappearance, quickly escalated their response. Officers began reaching out to those who had last seen her, retracing her steps and combing through any details that might provide a clue. Sonya's last known movements suggested she had been with friends, but the specifics of her departure remained a mystery. As investigators realized how out of character Sonya's silence was, the weight of the case intensified. Friends and family members gathered, organizing search efforts and distributing flyers, hoping against hope that someone had seen her or could recall something that would lead them to her. But with every hour that passed, the grim reality grew more apparent. This was no ordinary case of a young woman running late or avoiding calls. Sonia's sudden disappearance, in the safety of her own community, marked the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Nome and force its residents to confront a terrifying truth: that danger could strike even in the most familiar and seemingly secure places. As the search for Sonya Ivanoff intensified, police combed the surrounding areas, hoping for any sign of the missing young woman. Despite the urgency, no one anticipated that within a few hours of initiating the search, the case would take a heart-wrenching turn. Just 3 hours after the investigation began, the grim discovery was made. Sonia's body had been found, lifeless and alone, ending the hopes of her safe return. Officer Byron Redburn, one of the first responders on the scene, came upon her body in an unusually tidy clearing. The area around her appeared undisturbed, as if Sonia had been placed there with deliberate care. There were no immediate signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, no torn clothing, no visible injuries on her body that could explain her tragic fate. The only detail that stood out was a single sock on one of her feet, an eerie, seemingly trivial detail that left investigators puzzled. The quiet of the scene was chilling, amplifying the sense of unnatural stillness that hung over the area. As Officer Redburn took in the scene, he realized that this wasn't merely a tragic accident or a death from natural causes. There was a disturbing, almost ritualistic quality to the way Sonia had been left, raising questions about what had happened in her final hours. This careful placement of her body pointed to something far darker, a calculated and possibly staged crime that hinted at a disturbing mind behind the act. The discovery of Sonia's body left both the investigators and the town reeling. For Nome's residents, the tragic find shattered their sense of security, leaving everyone wondering who among them could have committed such an act. The case was no longer just a missing person investigation. It had transformed into a murder case, one that would haunt Nome long after that day. With the heartbreaking discovery of Sonya Ivanoff's body, Nome's law enforcement began a full-scale investigation, aware that each minute counted. The police immediately secured the area, meticulously cordoning off the scene to prevent any contamination. Forensic investigator Carrie Cathcart arrived swiftly, stepping into a clearing that was eerily still, as if nature itself sensed the gravity of what had happened. Carrie's task was daunting: to capture every piece of evidence, no matter how minute, and to construct a timeline from the fractured remnants left behind. Carrie began by photographing the scene, capturing each angle and recording the environment. Her keen eye noted that Sonia's body, lying on the ground, was surrounded by undisturbed foliage, suggesting she had been placed with care. But as Carrie examined Sonia more closely, a darker story began to reveal itself. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of violence, with deep bruising along her cheekbones and around her jawline. The discoloration of the bruises indicated that these injuries had been inflicted shortly before her death, suggesting a final, violent struggle with her assailant. Beyond the bruises, Carrie's attention was drawn to something even more chilling: faint traces of blood spattered close to Sonia's body. These small stains scattered on the ground hinted at her final moments, where she may have fought for her life. The presence of blood outside of her body suggested a struggle, possibly one that had taken place before she was moved to this location. Carrie carefully swabbed and documented each bloodstain, knowing it could reveal critical details in the lab. Nearby, another piece of evidence drew her eye: a set of tire tracks pressed into the soft, damp earth. The tracks were fresh, leading both to and from the location, suggesting a vehicle had been used to transport Sonia to this secluded spot. Carrie examined the pattern of the tread, noting the width and depth of the tracks. From these details, she could infer the type of vehicle that may have been used, perhaps a truck or SUV, with enough space to carry a person and remain inconspicuous on the town's rougher roads. The tracks were a significant lead, indicating premeditation and suggesting that Sonia's killer had deliberately chosen this remote location to conceal her body. As she continued to document the scene, Carrie couldn't shake the feeling that this crime was as calculated as it was brutal. The bruises, the blood, and the tire tracks painted a grim picture of someone who had taken careful steps to cover their tracks. Yet despite these efforts, the scene was beginning to tell a story, a tale of violence, coldly concealed in a secluded clearing. Carrie knew that each piece of evidence she collected, no matter how small, would be critical in understanding the events leading to Sonia's tragic end. As the investigation pushed forward, the police and forensic team knew that Nome's sense of peace was shattered. The evidence gathered in those early hours would serve as the foundation of a case that would forever change the community. The story unfolding hinted at a predator who had exploited the town's trust, and Carrie was determined to see that the clues left behind would speak for Sonia and bring her justice. The investigation's focus quickly turned to finding suspects, starting with those closest to Sonia. The first name to emerge was Andrew "Donnie" Donnelly, a local man well known around Nome. Donnie had long harbored an intense infatuation with Sonia, a fascination that, while initially dismissed as harmless, had recently escalated into troubling behavior. Witnesses described his persistent attempts to gain her attention and noted his visible distress whenever she didn't reciprocate his feelings. Given his fixation, Donnie's name naturally surfaced as a person of interest, and he was promptly brought in for questioning. During his interview, Donnie appeared cooperative, readily providing details about his whereabouts on the night of Sonia's disappearance. He claimed he had spent the evening with friends and had a solid alibi, corroborated by multiple individuals who confirmed seeing him at a local bar. Despite his alibi, investigators were reluctant to rule him out entirely. Donnie's obsession with Sonia painted a motive that was difficult to ignore. The police decided to proceed with a search of his belongings, including his truck, hoping to uncover any evidence that might either confirm or dispel their suspicions. Upon inspecting Donnie's truck, forensic investigators discovered traces of blood on the back seat and along the truck bed. The discovery was a potential breakthrough, reigniting suspicions about his involvement. If the blood belonged to Sonia, it could provide the link needed to tie Donnie to her death. However, further testing yielded an unexpected result. The blood was identified as animal blood, most likely from a hunting trip. While it momentarily raised suspicions, this detail ultimately failed to connect him to the crime scene. The investigation into Donnie, though initially promising, left the detectives with more questions than answers. While his obsession with Sonia remained unsettling, his alibi, combined with the lack of forensic evidence tying him to her death, forced the police to consider other leads. Still, Donnie's involvement couldn't be entirely dismissed, and the team remained on high alert for any inconsistencies in his story. As Nome's investigators continued to comb through leads and potential suspects, the mystery surrounding Sonia's death only deepened, with each clue adding to the chilling puzzle that had now captivated the entire town. As the investigation into Sonya Ivanoff's tragic death continued, the autopsy report arrived with haunting revelations. The medical examiner confirmed that Sonia's life had been ended by a single shot from a .22 caliber bullet, a small but deadly round often associated with discreet, controlled violence. This was no chaotic act of rage. It was a calculated execution, a detail that left detectives unnerved. The lack of any defensive wounds suggested Sonia may have been caught off guard, making it unlikely that she had anticipated an attack. Additionally, there were no signs of sexual assault, ruling out one potential motive that investigators initially considered. Whoever killed Sonia had a different intent, one that remained disturbingly unclear. This case, initially tragic, now carried even darker implications. Investigators began reevaluating everything they knew, searching for connections to anyone who might possess the expertise and familiarity to carry out such a precise, restrained killing. They realized they might be facing a predator who knew how to commit the crime without leaving obvious evidence, a scenario that sent chills through the team. But it was the lead that came from a local resident, Allison Warren, that would truly transform the investigation. Days after the murder, Allison, a friend of Sonia's, approached detectives with a disturbing memory from the night Sonia disappeared. As Allison recounted, she had been walking home and had caught a glimpse of Sonia standing on a quiet street corner. Allison thought nothing of it until she saw Sonia enter a police car. In any other situation, this detail would have seemed routine. Police officers sometimes gave rides to residents, especially young women, as a courtesy in this tight-knit community. But now, with Sonia's death, the implications were chilling. As detectives listened to Allison's account, the room went silent. The possibility that Sonia had willingly entered a police car likely under the impression she was safe, brought forth a horrifying scenario. Someone within the force could be involved in her death. Such a betrayal would have been unimaginable. Police officers were the guardians of Nome, the figures residents turned to in times of danger. For one of them to be a suspect in Sonia's murder was beyond anything the community had ever faced. The investigation took a sharp turn. Now, instead of looking solely at external suspects, detectives had to scrutinize their own. An internal probe was launched, and investigators began meticulously reviewing the whereabouts of each officer on the night of Sonia's disappearance. They dug through records, traced movements, and cross-examined every possible detail, hoping to either confirm or disprove the horrifying lead. Meanwhile, word of Allison's testimony quickly spread through Nome, sending waves of shock and fear through the community. People who had once felt a sense of security in the presence of law enforcement now looked at officers with suspicion, wondering if someone they trusted could be a killer. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, and friends walked in pairs, wary of every shadow. The trust that had once been the foundation of this small town had been shattered, replaced by an unshakable fear that danger could lie anywhere, even behind a familiar badge. For the investigators, the case had become something larger than finding Sonia's killer. It was now a fight to uncover the truth hidden within the very institution meant to protect Nome. As they closed in on potential suspects, the team knew that each discovery would bring them closer to a resolution, but at a cost that the entire community would feel. With the chilling possibility that Sonia's killer might be a member of law enforcement, investigators turned their attention inward, reviewing each officer's whereabouts and actions on the night of her disappearance. Two names quickly came under scrutiny: Officers Paul Souza and Matthew Owens, both of whom had been on duty that night. While both men were seasoned members of the force, the suspicion surrounding them cast a shadow over their reputations and unsettled the entire department. Initially, both officers provided alibis, each claiming to have been engaged in routine patrols across Nome. However, as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Officer Matthew Owens's alibi raised red flags almost immediately. He claimed to have been stationed near a popular restaurant at a specific time, yet witnesses and records from that night conflicted with his story. Several people who frequented the area that evening could not recall seeing him, and surveillance footage showed no sign of his patrol car where he claimed to be. These discrepancies caused the investigative team to take a harder look at Matthew's potential involvement. In contrast, Officer Paul Souza's alibi held firm under scrutiny. According to computer logs, Paul had checked in at various points around town using his patrol car's onboard computer system, creating a verifiable timeline of his locations. His digital record matched both the expected patrol routes and witness accounts of his movements. Investigators found no deviation or delay that could place Paul near Sonia's last known location that night, allowing them to clear him of direct involvement. The mounting suspicion around Matthew Owens, however, was hard to ignore. Known around town as a quiet but sometimes temperamental officer, he had a reputation for being strict, even overly authoritative at times. The new inconsistencies in his alibi hinted at something potentially darker beneath his composed exterior. Investigators began to piece together a profile of Matthew's behaviors and past interactions with residents, noting any incidents where he may have demonstrated uncharacteristic aggression or had specific encounters with Sonia. As Matthew remained a person of interest, investigators combed through his personal records, looking for any past incidents, complaints, or interactions with Sonia that might reveal a motive. Simultaneously, forensic experts examined his patrol car, hoping to find any trace evidence that could place Sonia inside. This pursuit of truth had become painstaking, each step taken with the understanding that the consequences of their findings could forever change Nome. If Matthew Owens was indeed responsible, it would represent not only the loss of a young woman, but also a catastrophic betrayal of the community's trust. As the investigation into Sonya Ivanoff's murder grew more complex, a startling development threw the case into further chaos. A patrol car was reported stolen from the police department's lot. The theft of an official vehicle was a significant breach of security, and detectives immediately suspected that it could be connected to Sonia's case. It was rare for a patrol car to go missing, especially in a small town like Nome, And the timing of the theft raised suspicion that someone was trying to send a message or conceal evidence. When the stolen car was found abandoned on a remote road just outside town, investigators approached it with caution, recognizing that it could be a critical crime scene. As they examined the vehicle, they quickly noted disturbing evidence that suggested a connection to Sonia's case. Inside the patrol car, forensic experts found what appeared to be faint blood stains on the passenger seat. While tests were pending to confirm whether the blood belonged to Sonia, the presence of any blood at all in an official vehicle was deeply alarming. It hinted at the possibility that the stolen car had been used in the commission of a crime or to transport Sonia. But the most unsettling discovery was yet to come. Tucked into the vehicle's glove compartment, investigators found a small, crumpled note, hastily written but with a clear, menacing message. Silence the witness or be next. The note was unsigned, and the handwriting was almost deliberately scrawled to make identification difficult, but its implications were chilling. The message hinted at a conspiracy involving more than one person, and worse, it pointed a suspicious finger toward law enforcement. The phrase "be next" suggested that whoever left the note felt threatened themselves, adding a new layer of danger and complexity to the investigation. The discovery of the note left the investigative team reeling. The theft of the patrol car and the message left behind indicated that someone within the police force, or someone with close ties to it, might be involved not only in Sonia's death, but also in efforts to intimidate or obstruct the investigation. For Nome's investigators, this development was both terrifying and galvanizing. It meant that Sonia's case was far from over. In fact, they might be on the brink of uncovering a deeper, more insidious network of betrayal. With suspicions now extending to potentially more than one officer, the police department was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that they could be dealing with a conspiracy. The implications for the town were devastating. Investigators expanded their probe, re-examining every officer's actions on the night Sonia disappeared and cross-referencing every piece of evidence with renewed urgency. The stolen patrol car and the note were no longer just clues. They were harbingers of a case that threatened to unravel the very fabric of Nome's police force. After weeks of mounting evidence and extensive investigation, the case took a decisive turn when Officer Matthew Owens was formally arrested on suspicion of involvement in Sonya Ivanoff's murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Nome, a town that had long placed its trust in the local police force. As news spread, residents grappled with the unsettling realization that one of their own protectors had become a prime suspect in a brutal crime. Many found it hard to believe. Others had sensed something amiss long before. The arrest was a pivotal moment, signaling that investigators had gathered enough evidence to move forward. With Owens's inconsistent alibi, unexplained connections to the crime scene, and now the damning discovery of the stolen patrol car and threatening note, detectives had built a case too strong to ignore. Owens was taken into custody, but his arrest revealed far more than just the tragic story of Sonya Ivanoff's death. It uncovered an undercurrent of fear and intimidation that had quietly taken hold of the town. As the community came to terms with Owens' arrest, a disturbing pattern of alleged misconduct began to surface. Over the following days, reports emerged from local women who claimed to have been victims of Owens' abuse of power. In interviews and sworn statements, these women described a troubling history of intimidation, verbal threats, and in some cases, physical assault at the hands of Owens. His status as a law enforcement officer had provided him with leverage and protection, enabling him to act with impunity for years. Accounts surfaced of him using his authority to frighten and coerce, creating a climate where women felt unsafe speaking out. For Nome's residents, these revelations deepened the community's sense of betrayal. Owens, who had once been viewed as a public servant, was now exposed as someone who had allegedly exploited his position to prey on vulnerable individuals. The stories painted a chilling portrait of a man who had not only violated the trust placed in him, but then also fostered a culture of fear among those he was supposed to protect. The arrest of Matthew Owens marked a turning point in Nome's story. What had begun as a single murder investigation had grown into a far-reaching examination of power, accountability, and the devastating effects of betrayal. The community's demand for justice for Sonya Ivanoff now extended beyond a single case. It had become a call for healing and reform, a reckoning with the harsh reality that even those sworn to protect could harbor dark intentions. As the investigation into Matthew Owens intensified, detectives began digging into his personal history, revealing a complex and troubling portrait of the man at the center of Sonya Ivanoff's murder case. Born and raised in Alaska, Owens had endured a difficult upbringing marked by poverty and a fractured family life. His father, a former military officer, was known for his strict discipline, a trait that often bordered on cruelty. Friends and family described Owens as a quiet, reserved child who grew up under a constant shadow of harsh rules and expectations. The demands of his upbringing seemed to forge in him a deep need for control and authority, traits he later carried into his professional life. Owens joined the Nome police force in his early 20s, initially seen as an asset to the small department. But as time passed, troubling patterns began to emerge in his behavior. Reports from former colleagues and supervisors revealed that Owens often handled cases involving domestic disputes or confrontations with an unusual level of aggression, even towards those who were vulnerable or frightened. While he was technically within his rights to enforce the law, his manner of doing so was heavy-handed, often instilling fear rather than respect. Over the years, whispers of his misconduct started to circulate. Multiple women in Nome shared stories of their encounters with Owens, describing experiences of intimidation, threats, and harassment. Some allege that Owens had used his position to manipulate and control, taking advantage of his authority to discourage complaints. Most of these allegations never reached formal investigation stages, as the victims feared retribution from an officer they knew held substantial power within the community. It became evident that Owens had been able to exploit his position, creating an atmosphere where his misconduct went largely unchecked. The recent revelations following Sonya Ivanoff's death exposed these patterns of behavior in a new light. His arrest and the allegations surrounding him painted a portrait of a man who had used his badge not to protect, but to control, fostering a quiet reign of terror. For Nome's residents, this was not just a case of one rogue officer, it was a stark reminder of the abuses that could flourish under the guise of authority. Owens's background and long history of misconduct had finally come to light, revealing motivations rooted in a desire for dominance and control, cultivated over years of unchecked behavior. As more individuals came forward with their stories, Owens's troubled upbringing and pattern of abuse became central to understanding his motivations. He was a man who had been given power and wielded it ruthlessly, turning his authority into a weapon. The investigation now transcended Sonya's case, becoming a reckoning for a community grappling with the profound betrayal of trust and the dark secrets that had been hidden behind a badge. As investigators delved deeper into Matthew Owens' life, they left no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice for Sonya Ivanoff. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when they examined Owens's property more thoroughly, focusing on areas that could reveal traces of his involvement in the crime. Their search led them to a fire pit in his backyard, a seemingly ordinary spot that, upon closer inspection, became a pivotal piece of evidence in the case. Detectives and forensic analysts carefully sifted through the ashes and remnants in the fire pit, hoping to uncover any items that might connect Owens to Sonya. What they found was disturbing. Among the charred remains were small, identifiable fragments of Sonya's belongings. A half-burned piece of fabric, later matched to clothing Sonya was last seen wearing, and a set of partially melted keys were among the items retrieved. The keys, though damaged, still bore identifiable details that linked them to Sonya's apartment. These personal effects, hastily destroyed in an attempt to erase any evidence, provided a concrete connection between Owens and the victim. Each item pulled from the fire pit painted a grim picture of a cover-up. The burnt fabric suggested an attempt to dispose of any physical traces of Sonya, while the keys provided undeniable proof that something belonging to her had been in Owens's possession. Forensic analysis on these items, combined with DNA testing and witness accounts, helped build a compelling case against him. The discovery added an element of premeditation, suggesting that Owens had not only committed the crime, but also taken calculated steps to destroy evidence that could link him to it. With the charred items from the fire pit as critical evidence, investigators had what they needed to solidify the charges against Owens. These pieces were the final links in a chain of evidence, each item connecting him more directly to Sonia's murder. This new discovery brought both relief and sorrow to the community of Nome. Owens' actions had become chillingly clear, and the community, now faced with undeniable proof, came together in their grief and outrage, seeking justice for the young woman who had become a symbol of the town's shattered trust. The trial of Matthew Owens was one of the most anticipated events in Nome's history, drawing people from every corner of the community who came to witness justice being sought for Sonya Ivanoff. The courtroom was packed with Sonia's grieving family, close friends, and townspeople, all eager to see the case through to its end. Owens, once a trusted officer of the law, now stood as the accused, his demeanor steely and unrepentant. The weight of the town's anger and sorrow hung heavily in the room, a silent reminder of the devastating impact his actions had on the community. The prosecution methodically laid out the case against Owens, beginning with witness testimonies that revealed his history of intimidation, misconduct, and abuse of authority. The prosecutor highlighted Owens's obsession with control, underscoring how he used his position to manipulate those he was sworn to protect. Women from the community who had previously stayed silent for fear of retribution took the stand, recounting their experiences of Owens's coercive tactics and threats. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of a man who had long abused his power unchecked, slowly eroding the trust of those who once believed in him. Forensic evidence became the backbone of the prosecution's case. Analysts presented the key findings from the fire pit in Owens's backyard, displaying charred fragments of Sonia's clothing and her melted apartment keys as physical proof of his attempt to cover up his involvement in her death. DNA testing further solidified the case, identifying traces of Sonia's blood and personal items that linked her directly to Owens. The prosecutor emphasized the brutal premeditation behind Owens's actions, noting how he meticulously tried to erase any evidence that could tie him to the crime. Owens's defense attempted to cast doubt on the forensic findings, claiming contamination and misidentification, but their arguments were systematically dismantled by the prosecution's thorough preparation. The defense's case was weak, especially in the face of the overwhelming evidence of Sonia's belongings found in his fire pit and the absence of a verifiable alibi for Owens on the night of her murder. After days of witness testimony and forensic analysis, the jury was left with little room for doubt. When the time came for the jury to deliberate, it took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Matthew Owens was found guilty on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. The verdict was met with relief and somber satisfaction from Sonia's family and friends, who had waited for this moment with heavy hearts. During the sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful statement on the gravity of Owens' betrayal, condemning him for exploiting his role to harm the very people he was supposed to protect. The judge addressed the emotional damage inflicted on the community, acknowledging the sense of betrayal that permeated Nome and how Owens's actions had eroded the town's trust in law enforcement. Owens was sentenced to 21 years in prison, a sentence that ensured he would never again walk free. The lengthy sentence symbolized more than just punishment. It was a statement to the community and a reminder of the consequences of violating public trust. Sonia's family embraced, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that Owens would never again pose a threat to another person. As Owens was led from the courtroom, Nome took its first steps toward healing. The community was left to rebuild the sense of safety and trust that had been fractured, with Sonia's memory now a lasting symbol of resilience and the community's determination to uphold justice, no matter the cost. The tragic case of Sonya Ivanoff and the shocking betrayal by Officer Matthew Owens sent ripples far beyond the small town of Nome, reaching Alaska's lawmakers who recognized the urgent need for reform. In response to the case and the community's calls for stronger accountability, the Alaska legislature introduced and ultimately passed the Sonya Ivanoff Bill, a landmark piece of legislation aimed at addressing abuses of power within law enforcement. The Sonya Ivanoff Bill mandates maximum sentencing for police officers convicted of murder or violent crimes while on duty, ensuring that any law enforcement officer who uses their position to harm civilians faces the most severe penalties. This legislation reflects the gravity of betrayal involved when a trusted public official commits such acts, underscoring Alaska's commitment to upholding justice and maintaining public trust in its law enforcement agencies. The bill was championed by both community advocates and state officials who recognized that Sonya's case was a tragic reminder of the need for greater accountability. By enforcing stricter penalties, the Sonya Ivanoff bill aims to deter potential abuses within the police force and reaffirm Alaska's dedication to protecting its residents. The legislation has since become a powerful example for other states, highlighting the importance of safeguarding communities and preventing those in authority from exploiting their positions for harm. The murder of Sonya Ivanoff and the arrest of Officer Matthew Owens left an indelible mark on the Nome community. What began as a tragic loss soon grew into a profound reckoning with the trust they once placed in their local law enforcement. For a town as close-knit as Nome, the betrayal was especially painful. Residents who had always felt safe in the presence of the police were now questioning the very system that had failed to protect one of their own. While the Sonya Ivanoff bill represented a critical step toward justice and reform, the community's sense of safety and trust in law enforcement remains fragile. In the aftermath, Nome has rallied to honor Sonya's memory by strengthening its community bonds and advocating for transparency in its institutions. The town's resolve serves as a reminder of the importance of accountability and the need to uphold trust in those we count on for protection. Yet, the lingering question of how best to rebuild trust with law enforcement continues to shape local conversations, sparking new dialogues about oversight, responsibility, and community safety. If this story has resonated with you, I encourage you to share your thoughts on how communities can rebuild trust and prevent similar tragedies. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of true crime stories and the lessons they leave behind. Thank you for joining us in remembering Sonya and exploring the impact of her legacy.